Hello, everyone. I'm Kyler Cheatham, your host here at Bite Size. I'm so excited to be joined by my friend and colleague, Greg Toornman, today. And we will be talking about supply chain specifically. And Greg has such great experience in this. It's definitely a relevant conversation right now when it comes to making sure that your business is just thriving and resilient for kind of those next steps, whether it's technology, processes, people, all of those different things around that strategic approach. So before I turn it over to Greg to kind of introduce himself and welcome him to the show, as always, I'll go over just a few logistics. If this is your first time joining Bite Size Live, welcome. Thank you so much for being here today. You can find us on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also drop whatever insights or questions you want to share in the comments today. It aggregates from each platform and we're able to see all of those in real time. That's kind of the cool part about these types of conversations. Is being able to kind of engage in them. That's overall our mission here at Bite Size, is to add more transparency. There's never one way to do technology implementations. So it's always very helpful to exchange ideas and see what's best for your business. So with that, Greg, thanks so much for joining us today. We're so happy to have you. Will you say hi and do just a quick introduction to our audience today?
Sure, Kyler. Thank you for that. So, hello, everyone. My name is Greg Toornman. I'm a currently freelancer after working 20 years in the agricultural industry and about 10, 15 years in automotive and heavy truck prior to that. Currently focusing on what's happening in supply chain today and helping organizations build on that to be better prepared to support their organizational growth, customer experience, as well as have a little bit of fun along the way, which is very important
Yeah.
these days.
Absolutely, absolutely. And you've had so much experience really in industry, really revolutioning supply chains when it comes to looking at what the impact had, whether it's, something that is a global impact like COVID or, supplier issues and diversification using AI. I think it's just a wealth of experience today. So before we kind of get into the meat of it. Can you kind of define what a value lever is in supply chain today and what that really looks like for businesses? Where do they know that they need to focus their energy, or where are they seeing any gaps? How do they kind of define that?
Sure. And I'd like to start from a where are we coming from collectively,
Yeah,
right? And if you
yeah.
think of supply chain as a function or a group, historically it was very tactical and execution oriented and kind of in the backside of the business. COVID really introduced a different perspective on supply chain across the globe in many of the C-suite, offices, which was
Mhm.
great, right? And I think what really it set the tone for is wow, the supply chain can enable our business to succeed or
Mhm.
potentially not succeed as our plan.
Mhm.
So in looking at that, what are we seeing? We're seeing, organization supply chains evolving from that reactive firefighting chasing, where you've got a lot of heroes and people that have tons of experience and working knowledge between their ears, to one that is forward looking. Some
Mhm.
of that is tech enabled, right? Organizations that see how is it that we can prepare a supply chain to support a market growth initiative that may be expansion. It might be new markets, it might be new products, could be new customers. And with that, how do we design our supply chain to evolve into what I call a value chain? One that
Mhm.
understands value in the eyes of the end customer and through the organization. And Kyler, how is it that we design a supply chain? And typically it's kind of a vanilla spread if you think of where we're coming from. But now as organizations are becoming a bit more complex, different brands and markets and how they want to support those markets, the question comes up is, do we have a vanilla spread or do we need to have a little bit of a segmented setup based on
Mhm.
different channel to market strategies? I'll
Mhm.
pause there for a moment to digest that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the thesis of what you're saying is a specific supply chain strategy that is, in support of those enterprise goals. I think a lot of times what we had traditionally was more of a reactive supply chain as opposed to that proactive. And often we didn't see it as a real value driver to the business, right? We saw it as something that we kind of had to do, right? We have to get the product in here, we have to get it made. And this kind of turned our thinking and reframed it into how do we actually use this and leverage it to make our business more competitive, more efficient, find money, be more successful, all of those different things, which are so critical that you kind of touched on here. And that's such an important kind of piece to set the stage of what that looks like. And I see a lot of these questions coming in, so thank you so much for already tuning in with all of these questions here. I will get to them and kind of bring them into our conversation. As always, if I don't get to them, I'll go back and answer them. Our team will in within the hour after our conversation here. If you're joining after our live, just a reminder, you can still pop your comments in there. So let's go to one of these questions. It's actually our first one to come in, Greg, and it kind of talks about that chasing of visibility. A lot of what you said is chasing, right? We're trying to create this value chain, as you mentioned, which I think that term is we should just replace supply chain with value chain because that really should be the focus. Is everyone's chasing visibility? What separates companies that see from those that act? So basically, we're saying here, how do we take that visibility and make sure that we're using it to create actionable strategies in the business?
Sure, sure. Well, I mean, the one resource that is very expensive is time. So if you think about reactive, it's very expensive to reactive when you don't have any time. So if you're able to identify some of those forward-looking potential risks or actual risks as close to that event happening as possible through your visibility tools, whether that's your some cases could be paying attention, to what's going on.
Mhm.
Other cases could be disruption along a transportation route. Other cases could be weather events that are affecting your supply base or customer base. The faster you're able to, one, identify that ideally potential risk, two, have your operating culture that's going to see that, has a playbook of what do I do? Who do I contact? What specific play do I call out in order to, one, optimize time that will, two, offer you as an organization and your value stream possibly options that will then, number three, support the objective of what you're trying to achieve. That's getting product into your factories, getting
Mhm.
products to customers, whatever it might be. But managing that aspect of time is quite important. And I'm sure we're going to get into some examples of that here shortly.
Absolutely. And so we look at time and kind of digging into that. How important is kind of that constraint based scenario modeling
Yeah.
for these types of businesses? I assume it's pretty critical to know how much time that's going to cost you or really understand what to do so that we're not firefighting as much. I think there's always going to be some level of firefighting in supply chain, but we kind of understand what proactively we can do in those types of different scenarios.
I mean, Kyle, this for me is probably one of the biggest levers, value levers that an organization can bring into their suite of offerings. And what I call is the pressure test, right? You've
Mhm,
got your playbook, you've got your demand horizon, you've got, your inputs from your various parts of the organization. As you're able then to pressure test where are my capacity cracks, right,
mhm,
across your network of suppliers, internal, whatever it may be, that would basically say, if we get to a point, let's just say, of demand reaching X, here are the
mhm,
critical points that we're going to have. What is the time required to capacitize or expand those sources? Could be a new supplier, could be new machinery, whatever it might be. But by identifying what you need to do, how much time you need to take, what's it going to cost, you can prepare your organization to take proactive decisions as your demand environment starts to become a bit more clear,
Mhm.
or as your sales and marketing teams have a strong confidence level that demand plan is going to become reality. And you think about what does that affect as an organization, right? It's challenging when you have to, firefight to get approvals
Mhm.
internally, externally. But if you have time, back to the most one of the most critical resources, you can work that through your organization, allow your finance teams to understand the capital investments that may need to happen, your purchasing team to work with external suppliers, your internal manufacturing teams to find ways to get, 2 or 3 more % per day out
Mhm.
of a factory. And by managing that proactive view through your playbook, you identify those potential risks. Back to the visibility topic we talked earlier, right?
Mhm. Absolutely. And so, kind of digging into an example of that, I think it's always helpful. Like, all of this theory always sounds good, but until we actually understand how to look at that and how to, understand our scenarios, what do we have to do to be able to do this types of scenario modeling? Do we need specific data? Do we need certain visibility? Do we need the right people in the right seats? Like, what do we need to do to start making our supply chain more valuable?
Sure. I think probably the first and maybe one of the most important things, Kyler, is organizational alignment and why it's important, right?
That's a good
At
point.
at the end of the day, it's about the customer experience. It's about the cost. It's about the internal team kind of happy factor as some key things. And the more effective that organizations are at one, being aligned on what it is we want to achieve, that then allows the next stage or the foundational elements of data, right? Because data is going to be the backbone of any type of, call it, well, scenario planning, digital twin. There's a lot of different
Mhm,
words for it today,
mhm,
but data is going to be the first piece. The second element is going to be the connectivity across that value chain. How is it that you're able to work with your internal factories and your external sources of supply, your partners, in mapping out what my current capacities are today, or collectively ours?
mhm,
And then with that, understanding as the businesses are evolving and adapting, what's changing to those available capacities. As much that you can take out the human factor in that, the more dynamic you're going to be able to adjust to what's actually happening, right? And why
mhm.
do you want to take out the human? I mean, capacity is numbers. And if you have the ability to connect numbers to a machine, to a material or part number, to a set of aggregated demands, then you
Mhm.
understand time can be better managed across that value chain. People typically say, well, we don't want to invest money or do this or do that to do
Yeah,
that. But at the same time, they're saying we sure as heck don't want to spend money reacting to a
right.
firefighting mode that could have impact to customers or our business growth.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of the Toyota just in time lean inventory model. I'm sure you kind of that story, right? And so, they had this model prior to COVID-19 and really struggled with that. It was a very lean inventory supply chain strategy that had worked for them for a long time. But when, the chip crisis of, 2022 hit, then they some of their factories shut down. I think it was North America they shut down and in Japan, and production went down like thousands and thousands of vehicles. And
Right.
that was, they lost their top spot as the world's largest automaker in that type of model that had worked for them for a long time. And this now changed, obviously, a global pandemic is quite on a macro scale, but I think that that's an interesting example to look at how your supply chain needs to be a bit more agile. Would you
Mm.
agree, or what would your analysis be of that?
For sure. I was born into that kritsu out of college, so I understand it very well and remember it because it's ingrained in you once you
Yeah.
do it. And it's a great process overall. But
Mhm.
that was part of the kind of reflection, I think, where COVID started it, and then that propagated out to a series of other black swan events that allowed CEOs to really accept the fact that things are changing. And it's no longer about what is the extra cost going to be to carry an extra,
Hmm.
Y number of days in inventory, but versus what does it cost us if we don't, right? If I have a single source of supply
Hmm.
located somewhere, let's say wafer growth is being done in Malaysia, and something happens there outside of their control, do we have a fallback plan? And if the answer to that is no, then what are the potential risks downstream? Losing market share is something that most CEOs and their CEO suites don't want to have to deal with.
Hmm.
So again, managing time to be proactive, that's not free, but that's understanding across the value chain the risks of not being able to manage a single source in a way that effectively supports your business.
Hmm. Absolutely. And that, I mean, that's so well said, and really understanding those different what if and scenarios, right? And I think this question I like here from LinkedIn too is, what value lever and supply chain design is the most underutilized today? I'm curious your answer to this question.
I would say, Kyler, that there's a number of them, first of all.
Yeah,
And,
right.
and really, it depends on where an organization's supply chain maturity, organizational maturity, and the further up that maturity kind of stage or wave that an organization gets, they evolve their supply chain to value chain or organization. And with that, to answer your question, it's understanding the customer needs. What are we as a seller of products or services in terms of importance to that customer? What is that customer's ability to grow and what are they trying to do so that
Hmm.
we as a supplier can be prepared with our capacities, with our
Hmm.
responsiveness, with our lead times, whatever it might be. But it's very much a strong relationship, right? That has very much, I won't call it completely open books, but aligned long term fundamental alignment on where is it we collectively as a partnership want to take our collective business,
Hmm.
and ensuring that you've got capacity in place and not leveraging that capacity to 99% utilization. That's a perfect world, right? That's the
Hmm.
just in time that we grew up on in many
Hmm.
cases.
Hmm.
Yet today's dynamics are much more complicated than they were 20, 30, 40 years ago.
Hmm.
Globalization, geopolitical challenges, and for a supply chain leader or even an organizational leader to basically be willing to take a risk of not implementing sufficient capacity to handle real world activities is not in line with value in my eyes, because
Yeah.
within that it's more cost oriented, and cost
Mhm.
oriented, transactional oriented is short term reactive thinking in many cases, not all.
Yeah, absolutely. And this type of question always reminds me of kind of the Suez Canal block. You remember that?
Ooh, ooh,
Where
ooh,
they had the ever given. It's like, how do you scenario somebody blocking, a major shipping maritime canal that is
uh,
something that I mean, it stopped billions of dollars of trade, for 6 days.
mm,
Right. And so we think about something like that. And sometimes our most underutilized value lever is being agile and having those relationships and understanding, okay, my suppliers here or my suppliers here, and I'm able to really understand where I can pull from if these types of unforeseen unpredictable scenarios, because it must be, and you know this way better than I do, very very difficult to predict the unpredictable.
understood. And it's very valid. There's two ways, right? There's learning experience that says, okay, we had a Suez Canal issue, it was painful, we reacted our way through it. Where are the other opportunities for that type of risk to happen,
Yeah.
right? If you think about this past week, in the Middle East, right?
Mhm.
I mean, we could see oil stopped. What would that do?
Yeah.
That would do a lot of things to
Yeah. Yeah.
global economies.
Mhm.
So when you learn, you take each one of these events and you utilize that with your teams and your organization as a learning moment. An
Mhm.
example would be the Baltimore Bridge,
Yes.
right?
Oh, great
You know,
example.
in,
Yeah.
in my previous life, it's like, whoa, because that was our one of our largest, you know, importing of the, complete big units
Mhm.
on the into the U.S. Well, the interesting thing on that was we had experience and were prepared with our very we I call adaptive resilient supplier by the name of ACL.
Mhm.
That morning had already redirected our loads to be unloaded in,
Wow.
I believe it was New York. We actually, because we had a playbook, we said,
Yeah.
what if something happens? And what did that do? It enabled our sales to be 5% higher than what we expected 4 days
Right.
before month end because the shipment unloaded one day earlier than it would have in Baltimore. And we looked like heroes, right,
Yeah.
in the organization. But it was the result of having a playbook that was aligned across the stakeholder network as a result of learning experiences from the Suez Canal.
That's
Yep.
amazing. Yeah. So taking, those learnings, really activating it into your strategy. It sounds like, and something that I feel like you talk about that not a lot of people talk about is the actual power and potential of the supplier relationship. A lot of times our relationships with suppliers can be seen as something that can cause a lot of issues, right, for the business, but you almost see them as a partner, a business partner that is proactive in planning with you, as opposed to something that's hindering your planning. Can you
Yes.
talk a little bit more about the importance of that?
Absolutely, and it kind of ties back to the Toyota, right? The Toyota
Mhm.
Kritsu, the way that the Japanese. I mean, that's a stronger relationship or
Yeah.
network of trading partners, right? So let's go back to a story of COVID times, right? And I remember sitting on a plane in Shanghai, getting ready to take off on December the 6th, 2019, and
Mhm.
my Asian supply chain lead called me and said, "Hey, we're hearing about something going on in Wuhan area. We have two
Mhm.
suppliers. Da da da. Okay, let's monitor and see what happens." And then a few weeks later, we find out what government regulations were requiring for businesses to continue to operate. And what
Mhm.
did we do? We immediately started gathering PPE from around the world, from North America, from South America, from Europe, and sending it to China. And
Mhm.
we had that just stockpiling in our warehouses, and I'm getting hammered. Why are you doing this? I'm like, you'll see.
Mhm.
And then what we were able to do as the Chinese government was, releasing the protocols for what organizations had to operate in a safe environment, we were able to give, not sell, give to our
Yeah.
supply base PPE so that they could run our product first, but then operate their business, right?
Absolutely.
That comes with a organizational approach to how we're going to run things, and it was a win-win in the end
Mhm.
for us. I could talk a whole bunch of other stuff on that
Yeah.
topic, but I just wanted to
Yeah.
give you an example of why that is an organizational decision on how it is are we going to drive our collective supply chain
Uh-huh.
support, right? And it was phenomenal. And that played itself out in Europe and North America and South America then when our China team was able to aggregate product and distribute that to those areas, and the same thing happened. Lots of
I mean,
write-ups about that.
yeah, that's incredible. It certainly is. And again, I think the biggest piece of that is not only proactively moving and gathering and garnering all of these different things and offering them to your supplier, but more of that partnership piece. You knew you needed them, right? You knew you had to show up as a partner for them, so that they could get you what you need. And I think that type of mindset of bringing them into that more partnership is something that is definitely the supply chain value chain, right? Kind of what you talk about. They're part of that value. Should you have a diversification of suppliers? Sure, if it makes sense, but is it something that you need to kind of treat them and bring them into that planning? That is always a good way to, understand that scenario mapping.
You got it. And not every relationship is going to be in that situation,
Oh,
right?
sure.
Not every
Yeah,
source of supply is going to be as critical as some others. But
absolutely.
as much as you can have one face as a customer that suppliers and organizations like to engage with because they don't view it as tactical, transactional only,
Mhm.
you're probably going to get a better service overall, particularly in those very challenging times like many of us experience in that
Yeah,
2020 to 2023 timeframe, even
yeah,
today.
absolutely. And so I think this question from LinkedIn here, which is, what are some critical questions teams should ask when designing or redesigning their supply chain, kind of speaks to that. So we obviously had this forced transformation that, we had to react. But now that we're able to, maybe look at our supply chain in more of a strategic way, and redesign it, or understand maybe some technology that we can leverage to make us more efficient. What are some main areas that you see as maybe, stop gaps or red flags that really need to be looked at and redesigned when you're going through this process?
Well, Kyler, if you think of when I talked about segmented supply chains earlier in this
Mhm.
discussion, that is the result of understanding across the organization what are we trying to do collectively in terms of growing our business, maintaining our business, profit margins, revenue growth, whatever it might be, even new markets.
Mhm.
And having that supply chain design that supports that, because that's how we expect to grow our business. And growing our business means supporting these type of customer expectations.
Mhm.
Different, call it product levels, maybe a higher premium product that customers are willing to pay a premium for because they feel confident that they're receiving more value than what they're paying for.
Mhm.
Then your ability to design to say, okay, these customers are willing to pay a premium. We need to ensure that they will be able to have product. And in the agricultural industry, having product is somewhat a little bit variable based on weather conditions and things of that nature. So you have to be prepared. You have to be resilient in some cases, adaptive to what is happening with weather conditions. And as a result, build in enough sufficient capacity, again, not free,
Mhm.
to support that. I would say that would be one. Number two would be taking a look at, how many suppliers do I particularly have
Mhm.
for a critical component? Pretty similar to capacity, but
Mhm.
maybe now you're taking the perspective of maybe there's some geopolitical risks. So now I want to maybe have something in Asia and maybe I want to have something else in the
Mhm.
Americas that I can then utilize in case, call it insurance policy.
Mhm.
So, overall, where I think about redesigning a supply chain, some of that is reflective of where did we get burnt in the past?
Mhm.
Some of it is proactive, where are we going? And three, then, where do we need to have the insurance policy just in
Mhm.
case? And then build that in. That's either capital, that could be, in the form of inventory or machines.
Absolutely. And speaking of that kind of capital, what about those driving capital efficiencies through supply chain? So, not only kind of optimizing your supply chain, but finding capital from any sort of inefficiencies in your supply
Mhm.
chain.
Sure. So there's some topics we talked earlier. We talked about the digital twins and scenario planning. So if you have the ability to see across your network, internal, external, to see where do I have available capacities that I'm not utilizing to the level that I want to utilize them to. You as an organization can take the decision to say, am I willing to pay maybe a little bit more freight cost to get it from South America into North America compared to spending, millions of dollars in new buildings and machines in the North American market for some demand that might only be 6 months. I mean, you don't know. So
Hmm.
I would say one, the ability to understand your capacities in a connected, digitized way, a very effective way. The second element of that, Kyler, is going to be along the lines of how are you managing your processes,
Hmm.
right? And within that, where can you bring AI to speed up decision making that would then allow decisions to be made faster and subsequently maybe not requiring as much safety stock in certain
Hmm.
cases, right?
Hmm.
Of the inventory. Maybe a third element in terms of the capacity piece or capital piece would
Hmm.
be looking out as we talked about, and when am I going to need to buy new machines, invest in new buildings, add a supplier that enables your finance team to say, oh, in 3 years' time, right now we forecast we have to spend 200 million on X, Y, and
Hmm.
Z.
Hmm.
What is it that we potentially can prepare for as
Hmm.
far as cash flow allocations or whatever it might be? So by having more time, you've got, as we talked about, the ability to make different recommendations, allow senior leadership to take decisions that are, you know, in line with other activities going on within the business, M&A or expansion, whatever it might be. So
Hmm.
it's a complicated question because all too often we think about historically just reduce the inventory,
Yeah,
right?
maybe.
Maybe,
Yeah,
but
right.
right, what are your insurance policies then that
Exactly.
protect you and your value chain from possibly having that bad experience?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and as you said, each supply chain is so unique, right? Each supply chain has its own unique DNA. So being able to either bring someone in to do a quick analysis or something like that, I assume could be pretty helpful in these types of scenarios when you're trying to plan things that you might not have known. Maybe you have a legacy system that's been, your green screen for 30 years and you're trying to figure out, how to upgrade that. And you mentioned AI, which I'm proud of. Greg and we've made it 30 minutes without mentioning AI quite yet in this conversation. um, and that's where you need to move to, but a lot of times that is so complex in that not every single playbook works for every single organization. That's why it's so important to have your own unique visibility into that data, into how your supply chain's operating and where these opportunities are, because it is a balance. And definitely, it sounds like a very hard decision making process for the leadership team, because there's different balances in that, which brings me to kind of these. I have some questions in here about leadership. And so when you hit a disruption, what is your first instinct as a leader? And maybe kind of give us what should be your first instinct as a leader. Maybe some examples you've seen, or what you've kind of counseled your clients on to ensure that they stay grounded in these types of things and making good decisions for the business.
So if you were to ask me that question 10, 15 years ago, it'd be a completely different answer. It would be
Yeah.
something like why?
Mhm.
Who did something wrong? I mean, those were the kind of historicals. Now it's a little bit different. Now it's the question of when is the customer impacted? That could be internal, external.
Mhm.
Secondly, what options do we have? Third is likely going to be what is it going to cost? And
Mhm.
four is what is your recommendation? Coming from the team. It's not always management decides. We're
Mhm.
interested in thinkers that can assess a problem, come up with solutioning ideas, and as a result of that, making recommendations with confidence to how we as an organization can, resiliently work our way out of this situation,
Mhm.
right? And very much, over the course of time, you will see that the teams grow in confidence when you're asking them to make a recommendation. Because the first time they're like, what do you mean? In different parts of the world, maybe a little bit,
Yeah.
a little bit hesitant, right?
Mhm.
And what we were able to see was such a strong level of organizational maturity, and
Mhm.
with that a happy factor, because people now are not just drones executing. They're basically thinking, coming up with their own ideas, making recommendations. And what better way to have a plan executed than have the person lead it whose idea was on the solutioning protocol?
Mhm.
Now, leadership doesn't have to do that. Leadership is challenged to get the right people in the seats that are enabled and that can use the tools and technology to manage that time in order to make the right decisions in line with organizational objectives.
That's incredible. I feel like you could write a whole book on
There's a,
that overall
there's a few.
philosophy. Well, you should write one. We wanna read yours, Greg.
It's out there.
So, that kind of goes into this question from our team over at The Confluential on YouTube is how do you set up these teams that can pivot without constantly asking for permission or maybe, are able to make those suggestions, those thinkers, as you said?
Mhm. So it comes with an organizational focus on long-term foundational strength.
Mhm,
And then I say strength, bench strength, and the acceptance that things do happen outside of what we plan.
mhm,
So those type of roles, you can think of a water spider kind of moves along the top. During
mhm,
times of stability, they're working on continuous improvement across the organization, across the globe, across the region, across the brands, products, whatever it might be. But if a situation comes up, say it happens in Europe, you got one or two people in Europe that are in these roles, and one of them will get the assignment or just say, I'm taking it and running with it, right?
mhm,
And that means some of the continuous improvement stuff that they were working on may get handed off, may get paused, whatever it might be. But these people go into action, and
mhm,
these people are very well connected around the organization, right? They know the players, they know the processes, they know the limitations. Culturally, they're able to work with different cultures and be effective, right?
mhm,
Because during these stressful times, things can get kind of complicated, and you don't
mhm,
want that. You want people working together with the least amount of emotion as possible.
mhm,
So, to answer your question, we had resources in place that had, here's what your primary role is going to be through the continuous improvement process. Here's what your reactive role would be if an event happens or a potential risk arises. Then they
mhm,
also would lead the reflection to the Suez Canal topic earlier through closure of what are we going to do differently? Here's the four processes we need to adapt. Here's the gap that we have, possibly technology could support us with. And
mhm,
then they would kind of carry that through resolution. And I
mhm.
tell you, what we found with some of these people, I mean, a lot of them became plant managers,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Because they were so connected and they
yeah.
knew so many people. Well, that's perfect for a plant manager. You're connected from the customer to the supplier.
Mhm.
You're the quarterback.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And kind of building on that question, something I get specifically from a lot of the students that I lecture to at universities are how do you work across global cultures? How do you
Mhm.
really understand what that means? We were American, or I'm American, we were born in the US, I always say, and there's a lot of things that we won't understand when it comes to working across cultures. So, what would be your answer to that question? I'm curious with your experience.
So that was something that within, let's say, my high school days, a long
Mhm,
time ago, before energy was even here, where I said, I want to go into global business. But in order to be successful in that, need to understand the globe,
mhm,
right? And after having, assignments outside the US and living in Brazil and Switzerland and lots of time in China and in other places, I'm like, wow, this is super cool. Different
mhm,
perspectives, diverse, ideas. We need to have team members that are feeling and seeing the same experiences. So the
mhm,
ability to move from a rotational assignment type perspective, someone from South America to North America or Europe, wherever it might be, and vice versa, builds that bench strength that we talked about earlier, but also the bench capability to be able to work together.
Mhm.
And what does that then do for an organization? It grows that bond of the people
Mhm.
working together and allows them to fight for each other because they've got a relationship, they've got a friendship, they've broken bread, had a wine, had a beer, had a chocolate milk, whatever it is together. They know about each other's kids. I mean, if you pull a team together, put them on a field of people that
Mhm.
know each other versus another team that just comes together, you know what's going to happen.
Mhm.
The team that's
Absolutely.
connected is going to come through resiliently and strong, and they're going to have fun along the way, and they're going to be more open to pick up the phone and ask a question. How do you do this? Because I'm looking for a better way.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's so well said. Yeah, I was talking to the head of HR analytics at Lockheed Martin, who'd been there for 30 years, and he had said I had asked him, what's the most important metric that you measure, thinking he's going to be like attrition or all those different things, and he said trust in a team. And thinking that you actually can measure trust because of those relationships that are built, especially when you cross cultural lines, because a lot of times there's sensitivities there's things that you may say that's differently than someone else, but having that trust to say, I know you meant this, but it comes off this way in our culture. And I've been said that many times and I'm like, oh, I had no idea that's what that meant. I always think of my South African colleagues, when you say how's it, like they say how's it when they jump on a call with me or anything like that, but that kind of means like, what's up, bro? Like in an American talk, it's not a professional speak. So when we get on the call with the client and I say, how's it? They're like, ooh, you wouldn't want to say that in that type of situation. But because we trust each other, they're able to say, hey, Kyler, that's not how, we would essentially address a colleague here, with no judgment or anything like that. How would I know that? Right.
Mhm.
And they are able to say that to me because of the trust that we've built in
Right.
our relationship. So I think that's so well said.
And it goes bi-directional too, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Because there could be other cases where you would be able to help them out. And the
Oh, yeah,
collective outcome of that is two resources that are stronger as a result of each other.
absolutely. 100%. So let's dig into, in the last couple minutes here, Greg, I'd love to hear kind of what you're seeing in the technology space. Our audience is very technically based, and I know you've been, involved in all of these supply chain transformations, whether they are forced by, the global economy, or they're, being more proactive. So I'd love for you to talk about some of the innovations that you're seeing when it comes to supply chain specific technology.
I mean, there's so much stuff out there today, and it's not I'm on step one and I want to get to step 10. It's not
Mhm,
one step, first of all.
mhm,
It's a methodical approach that says, how am I going to build foundational steps, basically demonstrate sustained capability to utilize the technology and the underlying data, right? And we'll come back to that in order to be prepared for the next wave of change,
mhm, mhm,
right? So maybe we come back to and I should have started with the data. Having an understanding of where your data is across
mhm.
your business is probably the first thing that organizations need to take a look at. Just the
Absolutely.
first thing is it standardized data sets, right?
Mhm.
Does everybody call, a orange, or do they call it something else within the system? All right. So the way the data, maybe you got to come up with some middleware, to have the data kind of a homologation, if you will. From there, it's a matter of what problem are you trying to solve. Typically, you won't answer that question until you understand the processes that you've got in place. And then with that assessment of how can technology make that decision faster, better, without a human touch, right? 24/7. And as a result of that, what value are we expecting to get out of that investment? Okay. So call that at a very high level.
Mhm.
Then from there, when you get into some of the really cool stuff in terms of automation or what, AI, call it what you want, you can repurpose those human resources that were not as fast, maybe
Yeah.
somewhat biased, to now be taking a different approach to generating value for the organization. Maybe they're spending time up front in sales and marketing talking about a product go to market strategy in 3 years that the supply chain is preparing for. And with that, then they work back as an outcome of bringing together a technology. And I can share an example of one, let's call it maybe 13 years ago,
Mhm.
where from a transportation perspective, right? Historically, I'm a supplier, I've got to ship something, I either load it into the system or I call somebody. And then that person does something, and the next person does something. What we were very successfully able to do is basically automate that. And as a result, when the supplier would load in that we call transportation order, it
Mhm.
would basically go into the sausage machine with everything else being, wherever it's going across the globe, and come back with a tender automatically going to carrier number one. And they had so much time to accept it to carrier number two, then three, then four. And then eventually, if it got past five, it would go to six, would be the brokerage market. That's
Mhm.
when a human would be involved.
Mhm.
When you're shipping thousands of transactions a day, you can take
Mhm.
the human element out of that. You can
Mhm.
speed things up. You then can also leverage the cost element,
Mhm.
right? More complexity. And as a result of that, have a positive outcome that typically improves your cost base, your speed of decision and execution, and converting your human from a administrator to a value contributor to the organization,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
Some of the things today, like the digital twins and your ability to look across the network. Some of the other things in terms of the automated decision making. So I've got an inventory shrink in my
Mhm.
factory in California. I've got shipments that are coming in from, let's just say, Japan, and I've got shipments that are scheduled to ship out tomorrow from Japan into a
Mhm.
sea container. Well, I mean, today you can basically make that an auto-generated decision that would,
Mhm.
in the middle of the night, generate the change
Mhm.
request to the supplier to say, okay, we have to air freight that product
Mhm.
instead of shipping it by sea. Humans may not even be involved in that. Obviously, you're going to have your rules based on cost and da da da, but you can structure it that way,
Mhm.
right? So those are some of the great technologies, and then you think about predictive analytics
Mhm.
versus backward looking forecasting, right?
Mhm.
What in my past life, what we were able to do was so phenomenal when you evolve to when does a customer want to buy
Mhm.
versus when do a customer need to buy
Mhm.
based on a whole bunch of data elements. But within that, the predictive analytics can basically tell you with very, very good accuracy when the customer will buy,
Mhm.
right?
Absolutely.
That has so many downstream advantages to your organization in terms of ability to serve,
Uh-huh.
right? As well as, have the right supply chain resources prepared.
Yeah, absolutely. And those are all such interesting innovations. I think about like DHL and their predictive maintenance and route optimization too.
Sure.
And those are things I always wonder, if those they always talk about, I think they reported something like 30% efficiencies gained or something like that around their predictive maintenance because there's less downtime, like you mentioned,
Sure.
the downtime resources. When you have a larger supply chain that uses that big distribution channel, are those innovations, how important is your supplier data in that type of community? So kind of that shared data to be
Mhm.
able to have that type of visibility into making those innovations possible.
Well, in the case of DHL, I believe you're talking about their trucking predictive maintenance, right?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, yeah.
So within that, if you think about it, we've got great experience in a different product, but
Mhm,
within that, with your onboard diagnostics, you're able to basically determine when will you potentially have an issue with a system component, whatever it might be. The software then can basically say, okay, when is my next availability in terms of parts,
mhm,
maintenance, service bay, whatever it might be, and then flag that up to the operator to say, okay, you're going to need to have XYZ
Mhm.
maintenance services, parts replaced, whatever, within X number of operating hours. And by the way, here's a service bay, and the parts
Mhm.
will be available on June the 27th.
Mhm.
Would you like to confirm? Right?
Mhm.
If you think about what that then can do, right, you're able to keep your machines up and running because you're able to predict when you need to have it fixed by. Alternate resources then can be dispatched to support that.
Mhm.
Customer impact is what? Nothing, as long as you act,
Yeah.
right? So, again, back to the ability to formulate recommendations. In this
Uh-huh.
case, it would be from software to an operator, a fleet manager, whatever it might be, to say,
Mhm.
hey, we recommend doing this so that you don't have a reactive problem,
Mhm.
even though you're reacting to a potential risk. Right.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
it's there's so much opportunity out there for organizations to optimize their machine productivity as a
Mhm.
result of using data that's available to them today. That could be, a stamping press, machining center, a truck,
Mhm.
a tractor, a combine, whatever it might be.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love the way that you positioned the human operator, because a lot of, those recommendations are simply recommendations, right? You need someone that's going to be able to strategically think, well, does that actually make sense? We also have things like AI hallucinations. We've seen that recently in one of our clients where they said, the part was in, aisle 42 bin 7, right, but the part actually wasn't there. It was stocked there a couple months ago, and they kind of AI filled in the blanks.
Mm.
And we need to be able to kind of understand that oversight, so having those thinkers still in that position while using technology as a tool is really, critically important to that overall success of that type of piece.
I'm with you. I'm with you.
Yeah.
And it's probably going to be like that for some time, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we've all heard, oh, yeah, it's going to eliminate all these jobs.
Yeah.
I don't think so. I think it's
Yeah.
just going to unlock value opportunities
Absolutely.
that haven't been there in the past without a whole lot of incremental cost. So the investment into the technology is going to deliver better performance at the tactical execution level, then unlock the human resource to create more value. So the return is great.
Absolutely. And I mean, we sometimes misconstrue that jobs equal humans, right? A lot of those manual tasks that were in those jobs are being consumed by the technology, so that we now have human operators that move into more strategic positions. I mean, we even look in the data of LinkedIn, which we're streaming on live now, that in just year over year from 2023 to 2024, they had an 80% increase in AI focused positions, right? Those AI ethicists, those AI human operators, things that didn't exist a long time ago. So we'll see, how that goes within just the evolution of the technology and looking at those roles. But it's certainly something, to take a hard look at if you do have a supply chain, really thinking about how you maximize the value, how you are agile, and how you make sure that you understand all of the scenarios. And it sounds like that all really starts with data, is really that visibility. So
It does. It's that first step, and again, you can't kind of go from step one to step 10. It's sequential. It's you've got to build your foundation with sustained results and what I call the process ingrainment into your organization to affect it. And then you drive your continuous improvement and ask the what ifs and how and all this stuff. But that's where your value can be, exponentially gained, is
mhm,
when you start looking at where are we using too many humans that aren't
mhm,
fast enough or biased,
mhm.
whatever it might be, and take that out. Well, typically those roles aren't super happy with just being anyway. They're going to make
Yeah,
mistakes.
yeah.
So they're happier engaging with people outside. They get more visibility and they have a happier career, which
Mhm.
is very important to my point of having a little bit of fun earlier.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and that, that's how you keep people, right? That's how you keep those thinkers, is, to have that ability to have a little fun. So, and we
That's right.
love fun here at Bite
Mhm.
Size. So we so appreciate you joining us today, Greg. If our audience here does have any questions for you, how can they get in touch?
It's best to reach out to me via LinkedIn.
Cool.
Absolutely.
Excellent. And we have Greg's LinkedIn in the description wherever you're getting your episode today. But we really appreciate